I never thought a simple family dinner at the Ashwood Club, a place where power dined in silence and crystal, would become the night everything shattered. Not just the illusion of harmony I had tried so hard to preserve, but the very framework of identity I had allowed others to quietly rewrite for me. As I adjusted the emerald pendant around my neck, my grandmother's most treasured heirloom, I was already uneasy. Not because of the formality of the event, but because I could feel the cold calculation in my mother-in-law's eyes long before she spoke. I should have known something was coming the moment she insisted on a private dining suite, where no one could overhear what was meant to appear as genteel conversation, but would soon become a public ambush wrapped in silverware and linen. It wasn't the request itself that stunned me, though asking me in front of the entire Hargrove family to surrender my grandmother's necklace for safekeeping was audacious. It was the practiced way everyone else lowered their eyes, as if this were normal, as if stealing someone's legacy under the guise of family duty was merely another tradition to be honoured. And when I looked to my husband Warren, hoping just once that he'd defend something that mattered to me, he only murmured, "Let's not make a scene," as if my silence was the price of his comfort. That was the moment I realised I had been trained, not loved, managed, not respected. But what no one at that table expected, least of all my mother-in-law Eleanor Hargrove, with her smile carved from entitlement, was what I'd do next. Because while they'd spent 3 years pruning me into the perfect wife for their lineage, they'd forgotten that I wasn't raised to bow. I was raised by a woman who built something from nothing, who taught me to spot the moment where silence becomes surrender, and to never let it pass, unchallenged. So I reached under the table, pressed twice on the bracelet I never took off, and calmly looked Eleanor in the eye. And in less than 90 seconds, the quiet luxury of that dinner turned into something else entirely. I used to think losing yourself happened in a single dramatic moment, a betrayal so obvious it leaves no room for confusion. But I've since learned the more insidious kind of loss happens slowly, like erosion. You don't notice it at first. A comment here, a compromise there, until one day you wake up and barely recognize the person you've become or the life you're living. It began almost immediately after Warren and I announced our engagement. Eleanor, with her flawless pearls and disarming grace, welcomed me into the Hargrove family with warmth so practiced it felt maternal, until you noticed how every compliment carried a note of correction, and every gesture of inclusion subtly rewrote who I was. She never said I wasn't enough, not directly. She simply offered better ways to do things, smarter ways to dress, more appropriate ways to spend my time. At first, I chalked it up to family dynamics, an adjustment period. I'd grown up in a household where grit was worn like armour and independence was sacred. My grandmother, Isabella Navarro, had raised me on values built from decades of immigrant struggle and triumph. She founded Navarro Trade and Maritime from a rented garage in El Paso and built it into a multinational logistics company, brick by brick, deal by deal. She didn't just teach me business, she taught me to stand in my own light, a light that, in the Hargrove home, was considered too bold, too loud, too foreign. It started with my career. Eleanor suggested I take a sabbatical from Navarro Trade once I married, implying that charity galas and social luncheons required my full attention now. When I hesitated, Warren stepped in with the kind of tone that sounds like care but tastes like control. "Just for a year or two, darling. It'll give you space to settle in." I agreed, telling myself it was temporary, that I'd still have a voice in the company I helped modernize. But emails went unanswered, calls were rerouted, and invitations to board meetings quietly stopped arriving. Next came my clothes. My grandmother loved colours, deep maroons, cobalt blues, the kind of shades that carried memory and pride. But those hues didn't photograph well in the Hargrove holiday portraits. So I was encouraged, gently of course, to wear pastels and pearls, to choose timeless elegance over expressive exuberance. One evening, I returned from visiting my grandmother's grave wearing a red embroidered shawl she had given me, only to hear Eleanor sigh and say, "That's such a spirited choice. You know, it might be a bit strong for tomorrow's brunch." Even my friends began to fade from my calendar. Colleagues I'd collaborated with for years, women and men I trusted with major decisions, were deemed too transactional for family events. Eleanor insisted the Hargrove circle required a different level of discretion. Warren agreed. "There's a rhythm to our world," he said, as if their way of moving through life was inherently superior, and I merely needed time to adjust. The further I bent to fit into their mold, the more I disappeared. At first, I thought I was being gracious. I called it partnership. I told myself I was bridging cultures, blending traditions, honoring my marriage. But deep down, I knew I was shrinking. The final straw wasn't loud. It was the redecorated corner office at Navarro Trade, the very office where my grandmother had signed every major contract and hosted dignitaries from across the globe. When I returned one afternoon to drop off a few personal files, the vibrant Latin American art had been replaced with beige abstracts and minimalist brass sculptures. The ceramic vase my grandmother kept for fresh marigolds had vanished, along with the framed family recipe for her arroz con pollo she'd proudly displayed for visitors. "We wanted to modernize the aesthetic," Warren had said, casually, as if erasing legacy was simply part of the rebranding strategy. But the most painful realization didn't come from what they took. It came from how much of it I allowed. Piece by piece, I had traded who I was for who they needed me to be. I ignored the quiet unease. I explained away the silences, the omissions, the decisions made without me, even in spaces where I once held authority. I thought I was being wise, strategic even. I thought I was building bridges. But in truth, I was handing over bricks, pieces of myself, until there was almost nothing left to stand on. Still, I never questioned their motives out loud. I smiled through it. I played the role. I did what women are too often taught to do: keep the peace, be accommodating, trust that good intentions will somehow justify erasure. That night at the Ashwood, when Eleanor extended her diamond-ringed fingers across the table, asking for the necklace, I realized what was really at stake. It wasn't about emeralds or heirlooms, it was about the final piece, the last artifact of who I truly was still hanging from my neck, and I knew, if I gave it up, I wouldn't just be surrendering a necklace. I'd be surrendering me. Eleanor's hand was still outstretched across the table, adorned with the Hargrove family signet ring and a lifetime of unspoken assumptions. Her voice, cool and coaxing, had taken on that dangerous softness I'd come to recognize. The tone of someone convinced they were entitled to something they had no right to claim. "Darling," she said, her gaze resting on the emeralds at my collarbone like a hawk circling prey. "We're all just trying to protect what matters." It was a moment I'd seen coming for a long time, but had been too weary or perhaps too conditioned to acknowledge. Now, in the charged silence of that private dining room, surrounded by crystal, linen, and the curated civility of a family steeped in legacy and manipulation, I felt something shift. Not externally. No one at the table moved. No one raised a voice. The wine was still being poured, and the string quartet played on softly through the walls. But something inside me, the part of myself I had locked away for the sake of peace, partnership, and image, began to rise. Warren, seated beside me, leaned in with a whisper that tried to carry the weight of reason, but rang with something far colder. "Just give it to her," he murmured. "It's only a necklace. We can sort it out later." But it wasn't just a necklace. Not to me. Not ever. It was the last untouched artifact of a life I had nearly forgotten, of a woman who raised me to believe that strength didn't come from domination or inheritance, but from clarity, courage, and conviction. And that clarity hit me, sharp and sudden, like sunlight breaking through a fog I had mistaken for morning mist. I looked around the table, really looked, and I saw them, these people I had called family for 3 years, each of them watching me not with concern or love, but expectation. They expected me to yield, to apologize, to downplay my resistance so they could continue their quiet erasure, uninterrupted. Even Warren, the man I once believed I was building a life with, sat with his gaze averted, ashamed not of the request, but of the possibility I might defy it publicly. And that's when I understood what was happening wasn't some minor family disagreement or overstepped boundary. It was theft, not of property, but of personhood. And this wasn't their first attempt. This was simply the final piece in a pattern carefully assembled over years. Every redecoration, every silenced decision, every meeting held without me, every suggestion to let go of one more thing that tethered me to who I truly was. This was all part of it. This wasn't a moment. It was a culmination. My fingers brushed the custom bracelet on my wrist, a platinum band that matched my necklace and, to anyone else, might have looked like nothing more than a fashion statement. But hidden within was a discreet emergency alert device, one my grandmother had insisted all Navarro executives carry, especially when traveling with high-value assets. I had never used it before. Not in boardrooms, not during negotiations in far-flung ports, not even when facing threats far more tangible than this. But now, sitting beneath the chandeliers of the Ashwood, I realized I was confronting the most dangerous kind of threat, one that didn't aim to steal what you owned, but to erase who you were. Without a word, I pressed the button twice, our company's silent code for immediate non-violent intervention. I turned to Eleanor with a composure I hadn't felt in months, perhaps years. "I'm not surrendering my necklace," I said, my voice steady, though every muscle in my body hummed with tension. "Not now. Not ever." Howard Hargrove's face darkened, the affable mask slipping just enough to reveal the rigidity beneath. "You're being unreasonable, Alexandra," he said, his tone clipped. "This isn't how we handle matters in this family." "This," I replied calmly, "isn't your matter to handle." Warren reached for my hand under the table, perhaps hoping to soften me with one final gesture of shared intimacy, but it was too late. The intimacy had been broken long before by every silence he offered in place of support, every alliance he made with his family against me, every quiet betrayal cloaked in manners and marriage vows. The door opened before anyone could speak again. 3 individuals entered with quiet purpose. 2 men and a woman, dressed in charcoal suits, bearing no insignia or weapons, only the unmistakable presence of authority. Maria, my head of security, and my grandmother's former bodyguard, stepped forward with a nod that barely masked her readiness. "Ms. Navarro Hargrove," she said clearly, her gaze locked on mine, "you activated your alert. Is everything all right?" The confusion on the Hargrove faces was almost comical, if it hadn't been so deeply tragic. These were people who had spent their entire lives maneuvering through garden parties, private fundraisers, and legacy appointments. They didn't know how to respond to a woman who refused to play by the rules of subtle surrender. Howard sputtered something about privacy. Eleanor tried to regain her air of gracious authority. Warren stood, torn between shielding me and saving face. But I was already rising, the emeralds around my neck glowing under the soft light. No longer just heirlooms, but a declaration. "Thank you for responding, Maria," I said. "There's been an attempt to coerce me into surrendering personal property. I'm leaving now. Please escort me." And just like that, I turned from the table, from the theatre of genteel aggression, from the decades of legacy that weren't mine to carry, and walked out, not as Mrs. Warren Hargrove, the woman they had tried to reshape, but as Alexandra Navarro, granddaughter of Isabella, daughter of resilience, and rightful heir to a legacy no one would rewrite without a fight. By the time we pulled away from the Ashwood, the city lights of Charleston shimmered against the river like reflections of promises I had once believed would last. I sat in silence, the emeralds at my throat now pulsing with a quiet intensity, no longer delicate heirlooms but symbols of a war I hadn't even realized I'd been drafted into. Maria drove with her usual calm precision, the car gliding past blocks of quiet wealth and deeper shadows as I stared out the window, unsure whether I felt more rage or relief. I didn't go home. I didn't return to the Hargrove estate with its curated perfection and scripted comfort. Instead, I asked Maria to take me to Navarro Maritime headquarters, a place I hadn't visited after hours in over a year. Not because I didn't care, but because Warren and his father had convinced me it was more efficient to conduct my symbolic executive duties from their corporate wing uptown. The contrast was immediate. Where the Hargrove offices had been built to impress, with historic portraits, imported mahogany, and quiet whispers of generational wealth, the Navarro building stood tall in glass and steel, every inch a tribute to growth, grit, and transparency. My grandmother had designed it herself 15 years earlier, insisting that every window should welcome light, and every hallway should honor movement. The night guard, a former dock worker my grandmother had once promoted personally, straightened the moment he saw me, addressing me not as Mrs. Hargrove, but as Miss Navarro. It was subtle, but that acknowledgement felt like the first real breath I'd taken in months. As we rode the executive elevator to the top floor, Maria's security team silently swept the building, ensuring no one unexpected had access. The suite I had once worked in, every day, every hour, still bore my name on the glass door, but the air inside felt different. The art, though untouched, was coated in a thin layer of dust, and the chair behind the desk had been slightly repositioned, like someone had been sitting there just often enough to unsettle, but not enough to claim ownership. When I placed my palm on the biometric scanner, the welcome chimes sounded like a whisper from the past. The screen flickered to life, prompting a password I hadn't used since the day I was talked into delegating operational duties. Maria stepped back respectfully as I logged into the executive system, but I could feel her presence nearby, solid, watchful, loyal. What I found in the next few hours was worse than I could have imagined. Not just decisions made without my knowledge, but patterns, deliberate, methodical, unmistakably engineered. Email filters had been rewritten to forward certain communications directly to Warren and his father before ever reaching me. Authorization thresholds for financial transactions had been quietly adjusted, then lowered further, until my own approvals triggered review panels staffed with Hargrove-affiliated consultants. Some of my digital signatures had been applied to internal memos I had never seen, documenting approvals I had never given. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake, a glitch, an administrative oversight, but the deeper I dug, the more intentional it became. Every move had been carefully orchestrated to create the illusion of inclusion, while systematically reducing my authority to that of a ceremonial figurehead. I wasn't running the company anymore, not in any real sense. I was being handled. And then came the board minutes. Dozens of them, all meticulously recorded, each claiming my attendance and agreement during periods when I distinctly remembered being at Hargrove family events, charity luncheons, gala appearances, long weekends curated for photo opportunities and brand synergy. Yet here, in black and white, I had supposedly been voting to reorganize departments, approve cross-border mergers, and authorize shifts in executive leadership, none of which I had ever discussed, let alone agreed to. My heart clenched as I recognized the names of loyal Navarro staff who had been reassigned, demoted, or quietly pushed out over the past year. People who had stood by my grandmother during the company's leanest years, now replaced with consultants bearing vague titles and Hargrove business cards. "Oh, abuela," I whispered, touching the emeralds as if they might carry her voice back to me. "They're dismantling everything you built." But even as grief rose like a tide, it was met with something fiercer: resolve. Because the betrayal wasn't complete, not yet. They had moved fast, but not fast enough to sever me from the foundation my grandmother had so carefully laid. I still held the majority share. I still had executive clearance. And, more than that, I still had allies. As if summoned by that thought, Maria re-entered the office. Her voice was gentle but urgent. "Ms. Navarro, your husband has called your personal phone 17 times in the past hour. The Hargrove security system shows multiple vehicles arriving at the estate. Mr. Hargrove, his father, and at least 2 attorneys." I turned to her fully. "They're mobilizing. They're preparing to shut this down before I can push back." "They're trying," she said simply, "but we anticipated this." She stepped forward and handed me a thin file from her inner coat pocket. "Your grandmother asked me to prepare this in the event that control of Navarro Maritime ever became compromised. It outlines every security override, every buried contingency and," she paused, "a list of staff she believed would remain loyal to the Navarro legacy over any corporate affiliation." I opened the file slowly, recognizing familiar names: mentors, department heads, lifelong friends of the family, each one annotated in my grandmother's elegant, looping script. The sheer foresight was staggering. She had seen this coming, maybe not the specifics, but the possibility. She had trusted me to be strong enough to act when the moment came. And the moment had come. "Schedule a meeting," I said. "Legal team, first thing tomorrow. And have our systems team begin isolating and backing up every file touched by Hargrove consultants in the last 18 months. Maria nodded, already relaying orders through her encrypted communication. As she worked, I returned to the desk and stared out at the city my grandmother had once called her new beginning. Lights stretched across the harbour, tugboats moved between cargo ships, and, somewhere far below, cranes groaned as containers shifted. It was all still here, still moving, still alive. I wasn't late. I wasn't too late. They had tried to write me out of the story. Now, I would rewrite the ending. By dawn, I had barely slept, but sleep wasn't what I needed. Clarity had finally settled over me like armour. Not the kind forged from rage or spite, but the quiet, calculated kind that comes from seeing the truth for what it is and choosing, with full consciousness, not to let it define your future. As the sun rose over the harbour, casting golden streaks across the windows of Navarro Maritime, I stood in my grandmother's former office, now mine again in both name and purpose, and prepared for the day that would shift everything. My legal team arrived just after 6 a.m., led by Janet Cho, a woman my grandmother had personally recruited from a federal compliance board nearly a decade ago. Calm, razor-sharp, and fluent in both corporate law and strategic warfare, Janet reviewed the documentation Maria and I had unearthed overnight with a silent, growing tension that I recognized as barely contained fury. "They didn't just marginalize your authority," she said finally, laying down the annotated minutes and forged authorizations. "They constructed a false governance structure around your name, knowing full well it wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. This isn't just a betrayal. It's calculated fraud." "And we can prove it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "With what we have. Yes," Janet replied, her voice low but resolute. "Board signatures can be challenged. Your digital calendar and access logs contradicting your alleged attendance? That's powerful. But the surveillance footage your grandmother had archived, those backups no one outside of her inner circle knew existed, those are irrefutable." While Maria coordinated security lockdowns on every floor of the building, isolating servers and initiating protocols that hadn't been triggered in over a decade, Janet worked with her associates to draft a formal declaration for the board. We weren't just responding, we were reclaiming. By 8:15 a.m., every access credential linked to a Hargrove consultant or advisory board member had been revoked. Doors locked electronically, files encrypted and removed from shared servers. Maria had coordinated the physical securing of 3 satellite offices, ensuring no files were wiped, no devices moved. We had frozen accounts associated with suspicious transactions and flagged patterns indicative of internal redirection. Then came the calls. I reached out personally to 5 members of the Navarro Board of Governors, individuals who had known my grandmother for years and had served with distinction long before any Hargrove connection existed. I told them what I had found, what had been done in their name, and what I planned to do next. I didn't sugarcoat the risk or the fallout. I didn't ask for their approval. I simply told the truth and invited them to stand with me when I brought it into the light. They didn't hesitate. At 10 a.m. sharp, we convened an emergency board session via encrypted video. The domestic members gathered in our Charleston headquarters while international partners from our branches in Sao Paulo, Rotterdam, and Singapore joined from across time zones. For the first time in a year, I opened that meeting not with prepared remarks, not with talking points, but with documentation, screen shares of email redirects, side-by-side comparisons of approved and forged contracts, timestamped security logs, and video records from meetings I had never attended. The silence in that room as the evidence unfolded was thicker than judgment. It was the stunned stillness of people realizing that they had allowed a legacy to be hijacked in plain sight. When I showed them the internal memos suggesting that my role be transitioned into brand ambassadorship, while executive control was migrated to a private Hargrove entity, the mask slipped from every illusion the family had crafted. Richard arrived at the headquarters 15 minutes later. I saw him from the executive window as he stepped out of a polished black sedan, flanked by 2 attorneys and his father, Gregory Hargrove. Both men walked with the confidence of people accustomed to getting their way through inheritance and intimidation. But today, that confidence felt performative. They didn't know yet how much I had uncovered, how much I had already secured. Maria met them at the entrance and escorted them to the designated conference room, a space deliberately removed from the executive floor. They were greeted not by negotiation, but by formality. Janet followed, her legal team in tow, carrying binders, tablets, and a locked case containing original articles of incorporation, signed in my grandmother's handwriting. I walked in last. I wore green that day, not just because it matched the emeralds I refused to take off, but because it reminded me of the strength that runs in roots, the kind that doesn't need sunlight to grow. Richard stood as I entered, his expression carefully measured. "Alexandra," he said, using my full name as if that would re-establish the illusion of civility. "I think we should speak privately, before things become more complicated than necessary." I met his gaze not with anger, but with certainty. "What's complicated," I said, "is that you thought I wouldn't notice. That you and your father believed you could rewrite my history, repurpose my company, and redefine my future, all while pretending to protect me." Gregory stepped forward, his tone far less measured. "Let's not turn a family misunderstanding into a scandal, Miss Navarro. You have no idea how damaging public conflict can be. For everyone." Janet stepped between us before I could respond. "We're not here to negotiate damage control, Mr. Hargrove," she said. "We're here to inform you that your access has been suspended, your proxies revoked, and your influence over Navarro Maritime terminated, pending criminal investigation." The silence that followed was different from earlier. It was not the quiet of dawning awareness, but the stunned disbelief of men who had built empires on compliance and now found themselves facing something unfamiliar: resistance. They sputtered, denied, attempted charm, invoked family, legacy, partnership. They questioned my judgment, my experience, my stability. But every argument they made was grounded in the same faulty assumption that I was still the woman they had trained to second-guess herself. But I wasn't. Not anymore. "I'm not asking for your understanding," I told them, my voice steady but heavy with finality. "I'm reclaiming what was never yours to take. My name, my seat, my power, and the legacy of a woman whose blood still runs through this company like tide through port." As I left the room, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded, calm, prepared. Because revenge wasn't the goal. Restoration was, And that kind of justice doesn't scream or storm or destroy. It rebuilds. From the inside out. It wasn't Eleanor's arrival that surprised me. It was her timing. Just past noon, as Navarro's leadership team reviewed our global stabilization measures and finalized shareholder communications, Maria approached with a quiet alert. She's here. Alone. Requested a private audience. I paused for a moment, absorbing the weight of what that meant. Eleanor Hargrove didn't do unscheduled. She didn't do alone. And she certainly didn't request. Every gesture she made in the years I had known her was orchestrated with the same deliberateness she applied to her place cards at charity galas, impeccable, symbolic, and socially bulletproof. So when I instructed Maria to escort her to the rooftop garden, my grandmother's sanctuary, a space untouched by corporate maneuvering, I wasn't preparing for a negotiation. I was preparing for the reckoning. The wind was soft that day, rustling through the magnolia trees and bougainvillea vines Isabella had imported from Veracruz, and the air carried a stillness that seemed to wait for truth. Eleanor stood near a cluster of orchids, her back straight, her expression unreadable beneath a silk scarf, knotted just so. "Alexandra," she said smoothly, turning as I approached, "thank you for granting me this moment. I thought it best we speak without lawyers or spectacle." I said nothing at first, allowing silence to fill the space between us, a silence rich with everything that had gone unsaid over the years. Every veiled correction, every polite dismissal, every boundary crossed under the guise of tradition. I walked to the stone bench overlooking the harbour, the same bench where my grandmother once told me, "The most dangerous chains are the ones you decorate yourself." "I assume this is about damage control," I finally said, my tone even, my posture grounded. Eleanor's smile barely flickered. "Number. It's about reason. We both know this situation has spiraled beyond what anyone intended. Richard is devastated. Gregory is furious. The family is struggling to reconcile what they see as a complete rejection of all they've offered you." I turned toward her, studying her carefully. There was no apology in her voice, only regret that her plan had unraveled. "What they offered me," I said slowly, "was erasure, wrapped in etiquette, enforced through affection, and justified by legacy." She sighed, stepping closer, her heels clicking softly on the stone. "You always misunderstood. We were trying to help you fit into something bigger than yourself. The Hargrove legacy is not mine," I cut in, not harshly, but with finality. It never was. For a brief moment her composure cracked. "You're emotional right now," she said, voice tightening. "You've always been spirited. But this defiance, this crusade, isn't sustainable. You've humiliated the family. Do you really believe that anyone will stand by you after this? You've closed doors that won't reopen. You've alienated alliances we spent generations building." Her words, though sharp, sounded strangely outdated now, like weapons forged for a war that no longer existed. "I haven't closed any doors," I replied, "but I've stopped knocking on ones that lead to rooms designed to contain me." Her lips thinned. "This company wouldn't exist in its current form without the Hargroves' influence." I nodded. "You're right. It would be stronger, more honest, and still mine." There was a pause, a long one, where neither of us moved, and in that pause something old and brittle between us finally broke. "You never understood," she said softly. "We were elevating you." "No," I said, stepping forward. "You were absorbing me. There's a difference." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked around the garden, at the blooms she'd likely never noticed before, at the legacy that wasn't built in drawing rooms or passed down through trust funds, but forged in contracts negotiated over kitchen tables and decisions made under threat of loss. "I was trying to protect the brand," she finally said. "I was trying to protect myself," I replied. She straightened, the last of her warmth retreating behind that polished exterior. "Then I suppose you've made your position clear." "I have," I said, "and I didn't come here to argue, I came to end it." "End what?" The illusion, I said, that this was ever a partnership, that I was ever meant to be anything more than a vessel for your legacy. I may have married your son, but I never surrendered my name, my voice, or my purpose, and I won't start now. She stared at me, and for a moment I saw something flicker in her expression. Not fear, not anger, but a recognition she would never speak aloud. The kind you offer not to a rival, but to someone you underestimated. As she turned to leave, she paused. You know they'll come after you, she said quietly. Reputation, influence, litigation. This family doesn't forget. Neither do I replied, my voice calm, and I remember everything now. When the door closed behind her, I remained in the garden a while longer, letting the wind settle the adrenaline, letting the silence speak the words I didn't say aloud, because this wasn't about revenge, not anymore. This was about truth, about choosing to stop pretending, about refusing to allow my life, my company, and my grandmother's legacy to be rewritten by people who valued control more than connection. And as I touched the emeralds at my throat, stones once worn by a woman who built something from nothing, who never begged for belonging, I knew I had finally returned to myself. Not as Alexandra Hargrove, but as Alexandra Navarro. Unbought, unbroken, unmistakably home. The morning after Eleanor left the garden without looking back, the city felt different. Not because anything had physically changed, but because I had. The buildings were the same, the people still moved briskly through the crosswalks and markets and docks, but I walked among them no longer carrying the invisible weight of compromise disguised as belonging. I stood once more at the glass windows of the Navarro boardroom, this time with a view not obscured by doubt or guilt, but sharpened by clarity, and watched the sun cut across the harbour just as my grandmother once did, in the early hours before any deal was made, before any contract signed. She believed that legacy wasn't just what you left behind, but what you fought to preserve while still breathing. And in that moment, I finally understood the full scope of what she had built. Not just a company or a name, but a system of values coded into every decision, every hire, every supply chain agreement, and ethical partnership she had forged with conviction and intention. What the Hargroves had attempted wasn't simply hostile, it was predictable. Because people like them have always underestimated women like us. They mistake grace for weakness, patience for ignorance, and compromise for surrender. But we are not easily erased, and our strength doesn't scream in boardrooms or echo in social columns. It roots deep, grows quiet, and waits for storms, for silence, for moments just like this. Later that week, I delivered a keynote at the Southeastern Business Ethics Symposium. It was a last-minute inclusion, and some assumed I would cancel amidst the noise still swirling from the Hargrove fallout. But I didn't. I walked into that hall wearing the emeralds that had once marked me as vulnerable and now framed me as something else entirely. Restored. I spoke not of the betrayal, not directly, but of resilience, of how leadership isn't found in titles, but in the courage to realign with your principles when the world tries to pull you from them. I shared how companies, like people, lose themselves when they confuse influence with identity, and how recovery doesn't begin with revenge, but with remembering. The audience, executives, students, entrepreneurs, some weathered by losses of their own, sat in rapt attention, not because I had delivered a polished statement, but because I had lived one. When I stepped off the stage, a woman in her 60s approached with quiet tears in her eyes and said, "I left my voice at the altar 30 years ago. Today I remembered where I put it." That moment meant more to me than any lawsuit victory or recovered board vote, because it reminded me why I fought, not just for control, not just for justice, but for what happens after survival. Legacy. Back at Navarro Maritime, we initiated a new leadership structure, one that honoured experience, championed ethical transparency, and centred inclusion, not as a trend, but as a truth. I reappointed former department heads, reinstated diversity contracts cancelled under strategic simplification, and opened a mentorship program in my grandmother's name for women in international trade. As for the Hargroves, they did what such families do when their masks fall. They regrouped behind closed doors, recalibrated their image, and licked their wounds in private. The lawsuits they threatened never materialised, perhaps because they realised the risk of public exposure now lay with them, not with me. Or perhaps they simply knew the world had changed, and I had changed with it. Richard called once more, just once. I let it ring. Because there are some chapters you don't rewrite. You simply end them, with grace and finality, and place a period where someone else tried to put a comma. At night, when the building empties and the harbour grows quiet again, I sometimes sit alone in my office and read the last handwritten note my grandmother left for me. In her looping script, weathered but firm, she wrote, "If they try to take what you've built, don't just defend the walls, replant the foundation. Your roots know how to grow through stone." I keep that letter beneath the glass on my desk now, not as armour, as a reminder, because this wasn't the story of a woman scorned. It was the story of a legacy reclaimed, and I, Alexandra Navarro, am just getting started. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever felt unseen, erased, or forced to dim your light for the comfort of others, know this: your story doesn't end in surrender. It begins again with one brave decision to stand tall. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, real narratives of betrayal, redemption, and the quiet revenge of rebuilding a life that no one can take from you. And if you've been where Alexandra has, tell us in the comments, what did it take for you to reclaim your voice? Because your truth deserves to be told, and we're here to help tell it.